Hello. We're starting at page 178. One day, my mother said to me, "You're always talking about Madame de Germont." Well, because Dr. Percepid took such a good care of her 4 years ago. She's coming to Combray to attend his daughter's wedding. You'll be able to see her at the ceremony. It was from Dr. Percepid, in fact, that I had heard the most talk about Madame de Germont. He had even shown us an issue of Illustrated magazine, in which she was depicted in the costume she wore to a fancy dress ball at the home of Princess de Lyon. Suddenly, during the wedding service, a movement made by the verger as he shifted his position allowed me to see, sitting in a chapel, a blonde lady with a large nose, piercing blue eyes, a full tie of smooth, shiny, new mauve silk, and a little pimple at the corner of her nose. And because on the surface of her face, which was red, as though she were very warm, I could distinguish bits of resemblance, diluted and barely perceptible, to the picture I had been shown, especially because the particular features that I observed in her, if I tried to enunciate them, were formulated in exactly the same words: a large nose, blue eyes, which Dr. Percepid had used when he described the Duchess de Germont in my presence. I said to myself, that lady looks like Madame de Germont. Now the chapel where she was attending the Mass was that of Gilbert the Bad, under the flat tombstones of which, golden and distended like cells of honey, rested the former counts of Brabant, and which I recalled was reserved, according to what I had been told, for the Germont family when any one of its members came to Combray for a ceremony. There probably could not be more than one woman who resembled Madame de Germont's picture, who on that day, the very same day when she in fact was supposed to come, was in that chapel. It was she. I was very disappointed. My disappointment came from the fact that I had never noticed, when I thought of Madame de Germont, that I was picturing her to myself in the colors of a tapestry or stained glass window, in another century of material difference from that of other living people. I had never realized that she might have a red face, a mauve tie like Madame Césarette, and the oval of her cheeks reminded me so much of people I had seen at our house that the suspicion touched me, dissipating immediately, however, that this lady and her generative principle in all her molecules was perhaps not essentially the Duchess de Germont, that instead her body, unaware of the name applied to it, belonged to a certain female type that also included the wives of doctors and shopkeepers. So that's Madame de Germont. That's what she is. That's all she is, said the attentive and astonished expression with which I contemplated an image, of course, quite unrelated to those which, under the same name of Madame de Germont, had appeared so many times in my daydreams, since this particular one, had not, like the others, been arbitrarily created by me, but had leaped to my eyes for the first time just a moment before in the church. An image which was not of the same kind, was not colorable at will like those which had so readily absorbed the orange tint of a syllable, but was so real that everything, even the pimple flaring up at the corner of her nose, attested to its subjection to the laws of life. Just as, in a transformation scene in the theater, a fold of the fairy's dress, a trembling of her little finger, betray the physical presence of a living actress, whereas we had not been sure if we were looking at a simple projection of light. But at the same time, I was trying to apply this image, which the prominent nose, the piercing eyes, pinned into my vision, perhaps because it was they that had first reached it, that made the first notch in it, at a moment when I had not yet had time to imagine that the woman who appeared before me could be Madame de Germant's. To this entirely recent, unchangeable image, the idea, "It's Madame de Germant's," without managing to do more than maneuver it in front of the image, like two discs separated by a gap. But this Madame de Germant's of whom I had so often dreamed, now that I could see that she actually existed outside of me, acquired from this an even greater power over my imagination, which, paralyzed for a moment by this contact with a reality so different from what it had expected, began to react and say to me, "Glorious, since before Charlemagne, the Germants had the right of life and death over their vassals. The Duchess de Germont is a descendant of Genevieve de Brabant. She does not know, nor would she consent to know, any of the people here." And oh, the marvelous independence of the human gaze, tied to the face by a cord so lax, so long, so extensible, that it can travel out far away from it, while Madame de Germont sat in the chapel above the tombs of her dead. Her gaze strolled here and there, climbed up the pillars, paused even on me like a ray of sunlight wandering through the nave. But a ray of sunlight which, at the moment I received its caress, seemed to me conscious. As for Madame de Germont herself, she remained motionless, sitting there like a mother does, who does not appear to see the bold pranks and indiscreet enterprises of her children, who play and call out to people she does not know. It was impossible for me to tell if she approved or disapproved in the idleness of her soul, of the vagabondage of her gaze. I felt it was important that she not leave before I had looked at her enough, because I remembered that for years now I had considered the sight of her eminently desirable, and I did not detach my eyes from her, as if each gaze could physically carry away and put in reserve inside me the memory of that prominent nose, those red cheeks, all the particular details that seemed so many precious, authentic, and singular pieces of information about her face. Now that I was impelled to consider it beautiful by all the thoughts I had brought to bear on it, and perhaps most of all by what is a kind of instinct to preserve the best parts of ourselves, by the desire we always have not to be disappointed, placing her once again, since she was the Duchess de Germont, whom I had evoked until then, were one and the same, above the rest of humanity, among whom the pure and simple sight of her body had for a moment made me confound her. I was irritated to hear people around me say, "She's better looking than Madame Cesaret. She's better looking than Mademoiselle Ventois," as if she were comparable to them. And as my gaze stopped at her blonde hair, her blue eyes, the fastening of her collar, and omitted the features that might have reminded me of other faces, I exclaimed in front of this sketch deliberately incomplete, "How beautiful she is! How noble! What I see before me is indeed a proud Germont, and a descendant of Genevieve de Brabant." And the attention which I illuminated her face isolated her to such an extent that today, if I think back to that ceremony, it is impossible for me to see a single one of the people who were present except for her and the verger, who responded affirmatively when I asked him if that was really Madame de Germont. But I can still see her, especially at the moment when the procession entered this sacristy, which was lit by the hot and intermittent sun of a day of wind and storm, in which Madame de Germont found herself surrounded by all the people of Combray, whose names she did not even know, but whose inferiority too loudly proclaimed her supremacy, for her not to feel a sincere benevolence towards them, and whom, besides, she hoped to impress even more by her good grace and simplicity, thus not being able to bestow those deliberate gazes charged with specific meaning which we address to someone we know, but only to allow her distracted thoughts to break free incessantly before her in a wave of blue light which she could not contain. She did not want that wave to disturb or appear to disdain the common people whom it encountered in passing, whom it touched again and again. I can still see, above her silky, swelling mauve tie, the gentle surprises in her eye, to which she had added, without daring to intend it for anyone but so that all might take their share of it, the slightly shy smile of a sovereign who looks as though she is apologizing to her vassals and loves them. That smile fell on me, who had not taken my eyes off her. Recalling, then, the gaze she had rested on me during the Mass, as blue as a ray of sunlight passing through Gilbert the Bad's window, I said to myself, "Why, she's actually paying attention to me." I believed that she liked me, that she would still think of me after she had left the church, that because of me perhaps she would be sad that evening in Germont. And immediately I loved her, because if it may sometimes be enough for us to fall in love with a woman if she looks at us with contempt, as I had thought Mademoiselle Swann had done, and if we think she will never belong to us, sometimes, too, it may be enough if she looks at us with kindness, as Madame de Germont was doing, and if we think she may some day belong to us. Her eyes turned blue as a periwinkle, which was impossible to pick, yet which she had dedicated to me, and the sun, threatened by a cloud, but still beating down with all its strength on the square and in the sacristy, gave a geranium-flesh tint to the red carpets that had been laid down on the ground for the solemnities, and over which Madame de Germont advanced smiling. And added to their woolly weave a rosy velvet, an epidermis of light, the sort of tenderness, the sort of grave sweetness amid pomp and joy that characterized certain pages of Lohengrin, certain paintings by Carpaccio, and that explain why Baudelaire was able to apply to the sound of the trumpet the epitaph delicious. How much more distressing still, after that day, during my walks along the Swanns Way, did it seem to me than it had seemed before, to have no aptitude for literature, and to have to give up all hope of ever being a famous writer. The sorrow I felt over this, as I daydreamed alone, a little apart from the others, made me suffer so much that in order to not feel it any more, my mind, of its own accord, by a sort of inhibition in the face of pain, would stop thinking altogether about poems, novels, a poetic future on which my lack of talent forbade me to depend. Then, quite apart from all these literary preoccupations, and not connected to them in any way, suddenly a roof, a glimmer of sun on a stone, the smell of the road would stop me, because of a particular pleasure they gave me, and also because they seemed to be concealing, beyond what I could see, something which they were inviting me to come take, and which, despite my efforts, I could not manage to discover. Since I felt it could be profound within them, I would stay there, motionless, looking, breathing, trying to go with my thoughts beyond the image of the smell. And if I had to catch up with my grandfather, continue on my way, I would try to find them again by closing my eyes. I would concentrate on recalling precisely the line of the roof, the shade of the stone, which, without my being able to understand why, had seemed to me so full, so ready to open, to yield me the thing for which they themselves were merely a cover. Of course, it was not impressions of this kind that would give me back the hope I had lost of succeeding in becoming a writer and a poet someday, because they were always tied to a particular object with no intellectual value and no reference to any abstract truth. But at least they gave me an unreasoning pleasure, the illusion of a sort of fecundity, and so distracted from me the tedium from the sense of my own impotence, which I had felt each time I looked for a philosophical subject for a great literary work. But so arduous was the task imposed on my consciousness by the impressions I received from form, fragrance, or color, to try to perceive what was concealed behind them, that I would soon look for excuses that would allow me to save myself from this effort. And spare myself this fatigue. Fortunately, my parents would call me. I would feel I did not have the tranquility I needed at the moment for pursuing my search in a useful way, and that it would be better not to think about it any more until I was back at home, and not to fatigue myself beforehand to no purpose. And so I would stop concerning myself with this unknown thing that was enveloped in a form or a fragrance, feeling quite easy in my mind, since I was bringing it back to the house protected by the covering of images under which I would find it alive, like the fish that, on days when I had been allowed to go fishing, I would carry home in my creel covered by a layer of grass that kept them fresh. Once I was back at the house, I would think about other things, and so there would accumulate in my mind, as in the room, the flowers I had gathered on my walks or objects I had been given, a stone on which a glimmer of light played, a roof, the sound of a bell, a smell of leaves, many different images, beneath which the reality I sensed but did not have enough determination to discover had died long before. Once, however, when our walk had extended far beyond its usual duration, and we were very happy to encounter, halfway home as the afternoon was ending, Dr. Percepid, who going past at full speed in his carriage, recognized us and invited us to climb in with him. I had an impression of this kind, and did not abandon it without studying it a little. They had had me climb up next to the coachman. We were going, because the wind, before returning to Combray, the doctor still had to stop at Martinville-le-Sac to see a patient, at whose door it had been agreed that we would wait for him. At the bend of a road, I suddenly experienced that special pleasure which was unlike any other, when I saw the two steeples of Martinville shining in the setting sun and appearing to change position with the motion of our carriage and the windings of the road. And then the steeple of Vic, which, though separated from them by a hill and a valley situated on a higher plateau in the distance, seemed to be right next to them. As I noted the shape of their spires, the shifting of their lines, the sunlight on their surfaces, I felt that I was not reaching the full depth of my impression, that something was behind that motion, that brightness, something which they seemed at once to contain and conceal. The steeples appeared so distant, and we seemed to approach them so slowly, that I was surprised when we stopped a few minutes later in front of the Martinville church. I did not know why I had taken such pleasure in the sight of them on the horizon, and the obligation to try to discover the reason seemed to me quite painful. I wanted to hold and reserve in my head those lines moving in the sun, and not think about them any more. And it is quite likely that had I done so, the two steeples would have gone forever to join the many trees, rooftops, fragrances, sounds that I had distinguished from others because of the obscure pleasure they gave me, which I never thoroughly studied. I got down to talk to my parents while we waited for the doctor. Then we set off again. I was back in my place on the seat. I turned my head to see the steeples again, a little later, glimpsing them one last time at a bend in the road, since the coachman, who did not seem inclined to talk, had hardly answered anything I said. I was obliged, for lack of other company, to fall back on my own and try to recall my steeples. Soon their lines and their sunlit surfaces split apart, as if they were a sort of bark. A little of what was hidden from me inside them appeared to me. I had a thought which had not existed a moment before, which took shape in words in my head, and the pleasure I had just recently experienced at the sight of them was so increased by this, that seized by a sort of drunkenness, I could no longer think of anything else. At that moment, as we were already far away from Martinville, turning my head, I caught sight of them again, quite black this time, for the sun had already set. At moments, the bends of the road would hide from me, then they showed themselves one last time, and finally I did not see them again. Without saying to myself that what was hidden behind the steeples of Martinville had to be something inaugural. I can't think of how to say this word. I know this word. Analogous? I'll look it up. To a pretty sentence. Since it had appeared to me in the form of words that gave me pleasure, I asked the doctor for a pencil and some paper and I composed, despite the jolts of the carriage, and in order to ease my conscience and yield to my enthusiasm, the following little piece that I have since found again, and that I have not had to submit to more than a few changes. Alone, rising from the level of the plain, and appearing lost in the open country, two steeples of Martinville ascended towards the sky. Soon we saw three, wheeling around boldly to position itself opposite them. The laggard steeple of Vieux had come along to join them. The minutes were passing, we were going fast, and yet the three steeples were still far away ahead of us, like three birds poised on the plain, motionless, distinguishable in the sunlight. Then the steeple of Vieux moved away, receded into the distance, and the steeples of Martinville remained alone, illuminated by the light of the setting sun, which even at that distance I saw playing and smiling on their sloping sides. We had taken so long approaching them that I was thinking about the time we would still need in order to reach them, when suddenly the carriage turned and set us down at their feet, and they had flung themselves so roughly in front of it that we had only just time to stop in order to not run into the porch. We continued on our way. We had already left Martinville a little while before, and the village, after accompanying us for a few seconds, had disappeared, when lingering alone on the horizon to watch us flee, its steeples, and that of Vieux, still waved goodbye with their sunlit tops. At times one of them would draw aside, so that the other two could glimpse us again for an instant, but the road changed direction. They swung around in the light like three golden pivots and disappeared from my gaze. A little later, when we were already close to Cambrai, and the sun had set. I caught sight of them one last time from very far away, seeming now no more than 3 flowers painted on the sky above the low line of the field. They reminded me, too, of 3 young girls in a legend, abandoned in a solitary place where darkness was already falling. And while we moved off at a gallop, I saw them timidly seek their way, and, after some awkward stumbling of their noble silhouettes, pressed against one another, slipped behind one another, now forming against the still pink sky no more than a single black shape, charming and resigned, and fade away into the night. I never thought of this page again, but at that moment, when in the corner of the seat where the doctor's coachman usually placed in a basket the poultry he had bought at the market in Martinville, I had finished writing it. I was so happy. I felt it had so perfectly relieved me of those steeples and what they had been hiding behind them, that as if I myself were a hen and had just laid an egg, I began to sing at the top of my voice. That is page 186.